Hey there, Dango Stu here. Today's video is about painting an outboard lower unit and is proudly sponsored by marineengine.com. Last time we saw this gearbox, I was sending it off to be sandblasted. I actually think it was blasted with macadamia nut shells, but you know, the idea is the same. We'll have a look now at how it came out after the blasting. Blasting is great because it gets really clean, and where there are soft spots, metal gets eaten away. That's just, you know, par for the course. But I always see that as a good thing because you get to see where there's good metal, where there was bad metal, and you can do something about it. Or you can decide that it's a write-off. So we'll have a look and I'll show you what it's like. This is it now, and you can see that there's a couple of really reasonably big pits in it. They're not all the way through, and I think this part of the casing is actually quite thick, so I'm not worried about it at all. I think it's really interesting to see an old outboard like this and see how much of this pitting is on the front edge here, where the outboard's getting hit by silt and rocks and everything and sand as it's traveling through the water, and the water itself, I guess. And then on these trailing edges, it's actually still very smooth. Like here, it's almost perfect. To me, that says that a lot of this actually isn't electrolysis and corrosion. It actually is just straight abrasion. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by doing a few things. Here, this leading edge is chipped away a bit. So I'm actually going to try and TIG that. We'll do that first. We'll put a little bit of extra metal and just see if we can build that up enough that we can file it back. So I think that's how I'll repair that. There's a few wavy bits, like you can see here. So I'm going to have a go at just hammering those flat, maybe levering them, we'll see. And then after that, this is the other side, it's probably actually even more pitted. I'm going to use a bog to try and fill all this. Once it's bogged, we'll sand it, we'll prime it, we'll paint it, and you'll see the finished product. Okay, so first step is we'll go put it in the vise, and we'll just see if we can build this leading edge up a little bit with some filler metal. My plan here is to use a reasonably low heat, so a reasonably low current, have the amp set low, and just try and build the metal up beyond the old curve it used to be, and then being aluminium, we should be able to file it back pretty easily. So now the edge is sort of built up like this, a bit of aluminium all round. There was also a big divot here, so I had a go at filling inside that, and it actually went pretty well. I'm going to start by using a flap disc, which is essentially a disc with all these little flaps of sandpaper on them on a grinder. We'll get the bulk off. When we get close, I'll move to a hand file. It was going okay, but there was a little bit of a low spot here, so I just added a bit more filler metal. So that went okay in the scheme of things. We now have an edge that looks like that. So we've got back to not having that big chunk out of it. There's the top, you can see, like that. Still got a bit of pitting underneath, but same as everywhere, so we'll be doing the bogging to fix that hopefully. What I'm going to do first though is try and hammer out some of those sections that are a little bit bent and curved. When it comes to bending this, I did a bit of research on whether to heat it, whether to do it cold, and there hasn't been a clear answer in my mind. So what I'm going to do is use this as an experiment. I'm going to do some of it cold, I'm going to do some of it hot, then I'm going to do some of it where I've heated it and then quickly dunked it in water, then hammered it. So we'll try those three techniques, see if there's any noticeable difference. What I've done here is put a couple of steel blocks on top of the metal welding bench and clamped it down. You can see this is the section that's up. This is probably the worst one. So I might try this one cold and we'll see how that goes. I'm expecting this to be quite loud, that sort of sharp metal on metal, so I'm just going to put some earmuffs on for this. I think that's all I'm going to do. It's pretty close to flat now. That bent so easily that, you know, I think I'm just going to do all this cold. First hit you could feel it sort of bent. It didn't feel like it was going to break. It's hard to describe, but it actually felt good. So I'm just going to go along and do this whole edge just cold. Well, that came out pretty well. You know, it's not perfect. You could spend hours with a straight edge, you know, trying to get it spot on, but I've got to say, you're actually all here for a pretty momentous occasion on Dango Marine. The first time that working on an outboard was easier than expected. That's a rare thing. What I'm going to do now is give it a bit of a clean, because it's a bit grubby from me handling it now, and then I'm going to mix up some epoxy, and we're going to try and sort of put a coat to skim in some of the pitting and clean that up a bit. So just a clean cloth and some acetone, we'll just give it a quick wipe over. When I was speaking to Matthew, who does the sandblasting, I was saying I had some 2-part auto bog I was going to use, and he said, "Oh, you're better off using sort of like a metal epoxy." And I thought, oh, I've actually got some of that. So this is the one I've had in the fridge for quite a while. I got to admit, it's been in there probably about 3 years, so it's not new, but I'm going to give it a go. I think you need to consider this part of the project an experiment. Really, it's just a bit of fun to see how it turns out. Because of that, I'm using things that I've got lying around. If there is a better product, I'll let you know, because it's worth using the right thing if you're intending to do it and, you know, get a long-lasting result. But in my case, I'm just going to use what I've got. Turns out what I do have is a good product to use, but ideally it should be fresh. This particular epoxy is a 1-to-1, so you just pour it out of the tube in stripes that are about the same length. I'm going to make up a fair bit, because we've got a fair bit of bogging to do, unfortunately. So there we go, a 50-50 mix. Well, at least close enough for late night television. The trick, I think, with these larger divots, these larger sort of craters in here, is to make sure that you don't trap air under the epoxy. So you want to make sure you're really getting it down in there and you're not just creating a skin over an air bubble. What I'm going to use now is one of these thin sort of applicator blades. You get these from auto parts stores really cheap, and the metal ones are quite good. A little bit harder on the tightly curved sections, but should been going all right so far. This is what it looks like now after a bit of a skim of the epoxy on. That section's, you know, mostly done this side, certainly the bad section at the front here. You could go nuts and sort of fill all these little sections, but we will be priming and sanding still too. So I think I'm going to resist the urge to coat the whole gearbox in it. What I'm going to do now is let this dry. Just use up the last of it, may as well use it all. And once it dries, I'll turn it over. I'll do the same thing on the other side, and then we'll start sanding. The epoxy's all set now, I'll give you a look. I've had a little play at seeing how easy it is to sand, but there's quite a coating on all here. I probably could have skimmed it a little bit thinner, but never mind. What I'm going to do now is get the bulk of it off with a power sander, and then I'm just going to get a piece of sandpaper like this and just start finishing it up, ready for painting. I ended up doing quite a lot of sanding with the flap disc on the angle grinder, and it went pretty well. A flap disc's a very aggressive form of sanding, so you've got to be careful, but you've got a lot of control when it comes to these contours, so in that sense it was good. Because a flap disc is quite aggressive, it also let me take a bit of the aluminium away in places where I need to, round some edges, all that kind of stuff. I then went on with a bit of 400 grit sandpaper and just hand sanded the whole thing, and I'll show you now what it's looking like. So what you end up with is this kind of thing, where you're sanding till you can see bright metal again, and the epoxy is only left in the low points. I don't want a build up of epoxy, I don't want this sort of complete layer, so I've got it right back. So it's just all these little bits of pitting that the epoxy is left in. You'll see here in a few places I need to put more epoxy in. Here and here it hasn't quite filled the holes, so when I've sanded it there's still a little depression. If you were trying to get this to showroom condition, if it was say a classic outboard you were really looking to restore, you would just repeat the process. More epoxy on, let it set for a few days, sand it back, rinse, repeat. Keep doing that until you got the finish you're after. I really can't afford the time to do that. If I do that, it'll be 2 more days, the weekend will be gone, I have to make a different video. You know, that's life. I'm not too worried though, because A, it's going to be heaps better than it was, and B, if I wanted to turn it into a showroom condition gearbox or lower unit, I would actually need to put this epoxy over every square millimetre of it and sand it all multiple times, and it's just not worth it. So if you're looking to get that effect, just takes time. The techniques shown are the same. All right, what I'm going to do now is I've got just a rag stuffed in the gearbox here. It's okay to get a bit of paint around here. We're pushing the bearing carrier in. I've got all our plugs in, so dust and paint and whatever can't get in there. I'm then going to tape up the top here a little bit. I've got a rag on top of that oil seal. The oil seal's still in there, so I've got a rag in there. Then I'm just going to use a bit of masking tape. I'm going to mask up this threaded section. I'm also going to mask up here where the anode sits so that the anode's sitting against bare metal there. I'm going to paint the top surface here because I do want to get this as smooth as possible by having that primer in the pitting here, because we need our water pump to seal against here as well. We can always run a tap through the threads and clear those out again later, so I'm not so worried about that. Not really worried about painting the heads of the screws either, that's fine. So I'll do this little bit of masking and then we'll hang it up with some wire and give it its first coat of primer. This is the primer I'm going to be using, in case you want to look it up. I found this to actually be quite good. This is the primer I used on the aluminium when I painted the sort of glove box section, the dash section of the green machine. And the paint stuck really well there. It's actually an area that people step over and step on every day. So it probably gets, you know, people stepping over it maybe 5, 6 times a day. And it's been on, I don't know, 6 months to a year. And the paint stuck really well. So it's given me quite a bit of confidence in this primer. This company does also make a 2-part epoxy primer that apparently is better, according to their literature. If I was to be buying a primer specifically for this job, I probably would buy the 2-part epoxy primer, but because I got this, it's what I'm going to use. All right, let's rig this up and start spraying it. First step, as always, is give the can a really good shake. Then what I'm going to do is make sure the nozzle's clean, so do some test sprays so you're not getting that splatter, particularly if it's a used can. Then we're going to start from beyond the work, start spraying, and then spray at about 15 centimetre distance. And we're going to start before the work, spray across it till we're past it, then just keep going round in strokes. You're not looking to get a solid coat of paint with this first spray. If you do, you're putting too much on, it's going to run. So you're just getting a light coat. It'll dry really quickly in this heat particularly, and we can put another coat on. We'll probably even do 2 or 3 before I start giving it a light sand. I don't think this is going to have to dry very long at all, so I think I'll just give it 15 minutes almost, then just keep doing another light coat, and then we'll bring it in, we'll have a look, and we'll give it a sand. I've now got the 3 coats of primer on, but I realised I had the microphone switched off when I was showing it to you. So the idea was that I'd put these 3 coats on, and yeah, you can definitely see some dimpling and everything around there, so I sanded it back using about a 400 grit sandpaper. In some places I've sanded it right back to metal to use the primer as a bit of a filler. I think I'm fighting a bit of a losing battle though. I really need to take another week to do another 1 or 2 coats of epoxy first to get it good, but we're going to push on anyway. So now it's sanded up, I'm going to go put more coats of primer on. For the top coats, I've actually got 2 paints here, so I might have an experiment and see what colours they are and compare them to the rest of the outboard. This first paint is a Johnson Evinrude paint specifically, and it's the paint, according to this, that was used between 1981 and 1991. I think this outboard's a 94, so may not be the right colour. But fortunately this paint is the one they use from 1972 to present. So, from 1972 onwards they use this, then in 81 they changed to this, then they changed again at 91, but it was always the same from 1972 onwards. Got it. What I'll do is have a look at both colours, see which one matches best, and then I may need to blend the colour up the leg a little bit. I'm not going to respray the whole outboard, I can't be bothered, you know. But the leg is actually bad at the bottom and improves as it goes up, kind of logically. So I may as well respray it anyway, and this may help me blend the colours in a little bit. Here's my little test spray onto a glossy tap and eye box cover, so I think it sort of probably gives a good idea what they'll be like. The colours look identical. The top half here is the BRP paint and the bottom one here is the aftermarket one. The top one I felt, the BRP one, sprayed more nicely, so that's what I'm going to use. This is it with the dry primer on it now, finished up. Far from perfect, but Good enough for this outboard, I think. All right, let's put that white on. It's worth showing here that with these first coats of the white, you can still see the grey primer through it quite clearly. You want these coats to be really light. Multiple light coats will give you a much nicer finish in the end. These first few early coats have dried now, so I'm going to give it a sand with an 800 grit sandpaper and then do a few more coats. The last coat of paint's dried now, it's all finished. I'll give you a look. There you go. So, perfect really, you know. Alright, so maybe there's a few things I'd do differently. Because the internet's such a kind of forgiving place, I'll give you a close-up. Before we do that though, I guess one word about paint. So lower units get a really hard life, and general touch-up paint's not particularly tough. I'm often amazed how brand new outboards very quickly, as in within a couple of weeks, don't have any paint left on the tip of the skeg if the boat's been running through shallow water. So even a good factory paint job will still come off relatively easily if it's run through sand, essentially sandblasted, I guess. To help there, you've got a few options. I'm not quite sure powder coating is an option with these because you really don't want the powder to stick to the inside and various other places. Maybe if you seal it up, you could powder coat it. Another good option probably is some sort of two-part epoxy paint, something really, really tough. I don't know if Evinrude or BRP make a two-part epoxy paint that you can use that's colour matched, but you may be able to take the paint they supply, the touch-up paint, and say, look, I need something like this, but tougher. So that's definitely something else I could have done differently. There's two other things on the preparation side of things that I would do differently if I was looking to get sort of a bit of a top shelf finish. One is I'd invest in some sort of random orbital sander that had a bit of a sponge pad underneath so it could sort of shape to the contours of this lower unit, and maybe one, you can actually get ones that have a bit of a triangle shape and they're quite good for getting into corners, so I think that style might be quite good for doing this type of thing. To me it wasn't worth going and buying one to do it. I was happy just to use a highly inappropriate sander, which is a flat disc. I mean really it's for grinding metal just about, that's how aggressive they are. But you know, sometimes you just make do with what you got. The third thing is, if I wasn't under the time pressure to get this video out, I would have had another coat of the epoxy before I painted, possibly even a third coat. Just put more on, sanded it, put more on. You can't always see the problems, but you can certainly feel them. So it's a case of sort of putting it on, letting it dry, sanding it off, running your fingers over it, putting a bit more on, sanding it off, repeating that process. Most of the work is in the prep. The painting's actually reasonably trivial. I only did one coat of the epoxy in the sections that were bad, which means the holes weren't completely filled, and the areas that previously looked good relative to the bad sections got nothing, and now they kind of stand out as the bad sections. So, you know, you get what you put into it. So these holes here are the much deeper holes that had epoxy in them. They were much bigger before, but they needed one or two more skims over them to get them flush. The other thing you can see is these lines coming this way. This is the leading edge of the flap disc sander. It's a really aggressive sander. It's almost a grinding disc when it comes down to it. And you can see the leading edge does gouge in a bit. A bit of a foam pad random orbital sander over this would do a much, much, much better job. But I didn't have one, I didn't want to buy one. This mild pitting here at the time I thought wasn't too bad compared to the big chunks that were out at the front here. And I'm not worried about it, but if I wanted to, I could have actually put a really slight coat of the epoxy on there too, sanded it back, would have given it a much more, you know, glossy, smooth finish, but I'm not so stressed about that. I put the new grill in temporarily just to make it look a bit nicer. This is the taped up section, so when I get the anode in the mail, it'll be in contact with bare metal. This side came out a little bit better. I think the filling on the holes was better on this side, but you can still just see the scoring a little bit from the flap disc sander. I had a rag stuffed in the gearbox, so the paint's come in this front section. I'll have a look how far the bearing carrier goes in. It's different to the Yamaha style I'm used to, where they sort of touch up against this edge. And I might need to sand a bit in here, but at the end of the day, all I really need is the O-ring on the outside of the bearing carrier to make a good seal around the outside here. All up, didn't cost that much. It was $40 for the sandblasting, and then probably $20 for the paint, and then maybe $20 for the primer, so about $80 all up. Next week, we'll definitely be getting back to the boat build. A few people have been asking what's happening with that, and yes, I've been sort of, you know, being a bit slow with it. Really, I was waiting just to buy a bit more epoxy and some more wood, and Big thanks to all the people who signed up to the Patreon account, because that's really helped make that possible. So I've got that stuff now, and we'll be putting the longitudinals in the next video. All right, well in the meantime, take care, and I'll catch you soon.